Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you for joining this afternoon. I'm going to give a little bit of a background before we get into any of the proposals, but I want to talk a little bit about the process here. In past, we've had workshops that go on for a long time whenever we do a rulemaking regarding 911 with a lot of back and forth, actually hammering out the specific language. And in order to not have this process take a whole year, like we have with previous rulemakings, or close to a whole year, what I'd like to do is just talk about general proposals and concepts. And then we will, the commission will issue a notice of proposed rulemaking with proposed language. And then through that process, people can submit comments and suggestions for rewording and specific language. But so we're just going to talk about general concepts today about what I would like to see in a 911 reliability rulemaking, and get some input from you as to what you would like to see in a 911 reliability rulemaking. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. The topics we're going to be covering today, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of our current 911 reliability rules so that people have an understanding of what the current state of the commission's rules are regarding 911 reliability. What we can't include in our 911 reliability rules is really just a couple of guiding principles for regulation that will help guide what types of rules we consider in terms of a rulemaking to improve reliability of the 911 network. Then I'm going to go through several proposals for improving our 911 reliability rules here in Colorado. And while we're addressing the 911 rules, there are a couple of other proposals where it says additional proposals for this rulemaking. Those are a couple of other proposals that aren't necessarily directly related to 911 reliability, but they're things that have been discussed for some time now among stakeholders in the state. So I'm going to go over a couple of those. And then I'll stop at the end for some feedback from participants, but I'm not going to wait all the way to the end. So after each proposal, I'm going to ask that you let me get through the whole proposal, but after each proposal, I'll stop and we'll get comments and feedback from the attendees. This meeting is being recorded, so it's going to be available in case anybody couldn't attend in person. And if people have thoughts or comments that they want to provide me after the fact, that's fine too. You'll have my email address at the end of the presentation. So with that, does anybody have any questions or comments before we get started? Okay, so we'll start with that current overview, of our current 911 reliability rules. And it's primarily found in section 2143 of the Commission's rules. 2143 section A1 states that all BESPs providing 911 service to a governing body or PSAP's demarcation point shall take reasonable measures to provide reliable basic emergency service with respect to circuit diversity, central office backup power, and diverse network monitoring. Where feasible, 911 circuits shall be physically and geographically diverse. Now, that sounds like a strong statement, but it is very aspirational in nature. You'll notice that there are no penalties involved if the BESP fails to meet those goals, and it includes a lot of words like reasonable measures and where feasible, which really makes it a best effort kind of approach to 911 network reliability. Paragraph A2 requires that the BESP file a plan for improving 911 network reliability. CenturyLink did this in 2019. There's the preceding number in case you want to look up what that 911 reliability plan looks like. A lot of the documents in it are confidential, but if you sign a non-disclosure agreement, you can have access to those directly from CenturyLink. In response to this filing, stakeholders met for about a year and a half, reviewing and analyzing the documents that were filed by CenturyLink confidentially as part of the proceeding. I think a lot of the people on this call were part of that working group that all signed non-disclosure agreements so they could look at the maps that CenturyLink provided, look at the lists of areas of the state and areas of their network that lacked diversity, and talk about possible paths forward. But in the meantime, the legislature passed a state 911 surcharge that could potentially be leveraged to pay for improvements to the 911 network. And so as a result, commission staff, meaning myself, called for the workshops to be disbanded so that the commission could undergo a rulemaking to update the commission's 911 reliability rules to take advantage of that new funding mechanism. So what we're talking about here is that we talked about what the issues are. We talked about where 911 network reliability is lacking for over a year in those working groups. But until we had a way to pay for improvements to the network, we were kind of stalled. Now that we have a mechanism for improving the network or funding improvement of the network, that's when I called for those workshops to be disbanded so that we can undergo a rulemaking. And really the only thing that's been holding us up since then is that we wanted to finish the rulemaking that we had to implement the state 911 surcharge. That rulemaking is complete now, except for it has to be published by the Secretary of State. So once that's published, that rulemaking is complete. So it's time to start working on our next rulemaking, which is the 911 reliability rulemaking. The next section of the 911 reliability rules says that everyone should work together to collaboratively track the status of 911 outages, which I think is generally done fairly well. Sometimes we get reports of poor communication between the BESP and the PSAP, but I think overall, CenturyLink does a fairly good job of tracking outages and communicating with the PSAPs with some exceptions. Paragraph C requires that the BESP notify the governing body or PSAP as soon as possible regarding present or potential 911 outages. Paragraph D requires that the BESP file a contingency plan by April 30th of each year with specific data included. CenturyLink has complied with this requirement, and you can look at what they've filed in 18M-0294T as in Tom. Some of those documents are filed confidentially, but most of them are not. So you can view the majority of the documents filed in that proceeding. Paragraph E states that the BESP shall implement the contingency plan filed in compliance with Section D for outages that exceed or are anticipated to exceed 15 minutes. Technicians are also required to be on site within 2 hours or, quote, best effort. Paragraph G requires that the BESP or other local exchange carrier, if they're serving as the last mile connection to the PSAP, to notify the commission within 2 hours of basic emergency service outages. These are to be followed with a written report in 30 days. We're currently using a Google form for both the initial notification and 30-day report, which seems to be working fairly well. One unintended wrinkle in this is that because of how our definition of basic emergency service is written, if 911 calls are routed to any PSAP, it is not considered an outage. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But as an example, if an outage occurs in Pagosa Springs and the calls are routed by CenturyLink to Durango instead because they can't reach the PSAP in Pagosa Springs, it's not considered an outage under our rules, despite the hardship and difficulties that might put the PSAPs under. Paragraph H, following the restoration of service, governing bodies may request from the BESP a list of the callback numbers of any calls that were made to 911 but couldn't be completed due to the outage. The BESP must provide this information if it's available to them within 2 hours or as soon as possible. I have not heard if anyone has actually invoked this rule by requesting that information from CenturyLink following an outage, but that is something that was put into the 911 rules back in 2017, the last time we addressed this section of the Commission's rules. And so that's an overview of what's in our rules right now. And I'm going to stop and I'm going to pause and see if anybody has any questions or comments about our current state of the 911 rules. Okay, not hearing anything. So these are the guiding principle items that I talked about earlier. Things that we can't put in our 911 reliability rules. We can't impose any requirements on originating service providers. Entities acting in that capacity are deregulated by Colorado law. And when I'm talking about originating service providers, I'm talking about the provider that is the last provider providing comment to the end user. And somebody just sent a chat message. Okay. I will try to also watch the chat, Mandy, so that if you have comments, we can address those there. So this would be sometimes a CenturyLink, but it can also be AT&T, Verizon, Vonage, Viera Wireless. Any provider that's providing end user service is an originating service provider. And when they're acting in that capacity, Colorado law has essentially deregulated them. There's a few things that the commission can still is still involved with those carriers, like collecting the state 911 surcharge or the Colorado high cost support mechanism. But as far as regulating them for outages, that is something that is outside of the commission's jurisdiction. So we can require outage reporting from the company that is delivering 911 calls to the PSAP, that's the basic emergency service provider, which we do have authority over, but not from the companies delivering 911 calls from the caller to the BESP. The other guiding principle is that we can't require a company to take an action to improve its service without providing that company a mechanism for recovering its costs to comply. And where this comes from is that the commission's rules do require that basic emergency service be offered through a tariff that is cost-based, meaning that they can take a profit margin on top of their costs, but the pricing that they offer to the 911 authorities in the state for delivery of 911 calls has to be based on the company's actual costs. So if we're increasing their costs, we have to have a way for them to recover those costs. So if we're increasing their costs by having them make improvements to their network that will improve reliability, we have to have a way for them to recover those costs. So with that, I want to stop before I go into the first proposal to see if anybody has any thoughts or questions. So the first proposal, and it's kind of lengthy. First of all, I should apologize. They tell you never do a wall of text as your PowerPoint presentation, but I wanted to make sure that if anybody is looking at this presentation after the fact, they're actually getting information off of it instead of just a bullet point list without any context. So I apologize for the wall of text, but that was a conscious decision. So the first proposal is actually on 3 slides. I want to get through all 3 slides before I pause for comments so that people understand what the whole proposal is. But the first proposal is to, and this is really the meat of all of the proposals, is to require the BESP to amend the tariff to include an amount to be charged per concurrent session for the purpose of improving basic emergency service network reliability and resiliency, no greater than $500 per month per concurrent session. The commission will then include this additional tariff cost in its calculations when determining the state of 911 or the state 911 surcharge rate by October 1st of each year. The reason why I'm structuring it like this is because I want this to be budget neutral to the 911 authorities, but we have to create a funding mechanism or a source of funding that CenturyLink can use to improve its 911 network reliability if we want to require CenturyLink to do that. So by creating this tariff, and have it being based on number of concurrent sessions, we can essentially reimburse the 911 authorities through an increase in the state 911 surcharge. The funds from this additional tariff rate must not be commingled with any other funds, and the BESP must file an accounting of those funds with the commission quarterly. So this isn't just money that CenturyLink gets to keep or use for whatever purpose it wants. It has to be used for 911 network reliability, and to ensure that, it would have to be kept in a separate fund that CenturyLink would create, and CenturyLink would have to report to the commission on a quarterly basis the status of those funds. Require that the BESP file a plan with the Commission for expending those funds to improve basic emergency service reliability and resiliency. Funds may only be spent in accordance with this plan. In developing the plan, the BESP must take into consideration I worded this weirdly, but it needs to prioritize improvements so that that are most likely to reduce outages. So rural areas that currently lack basic emergency service network diversity, looking at the location of past outages for an indication of where improvements are needed the most. Those sorts of things would have to be taken into consideration. And it would also have to take into consideration the most economic technology to achieve improvement in diversity. This means that we would be directing CenturyLink not to just default to fiber build if that is their most preferred approach, if it's also the most expensive. They would also have to include microwave, satellite, cellular backup in their considerations. Doesn't mean that that's what they would result in, but that's what they would have to take that into consideration in the plan that they file with the Commission. Progress on implementing this plan will be included in the quarterly reports to the Commission. So the quarterly reports the Commission receives will be the state of the fund, what money has been expended out of the fund, and what parts of the plan that have been filed by CenturyLink have been funded by implementation of that plan. And then finally, this is the third slide on this first proposal. Any interest earned by the company from these funds will be deposited back into the account. The BESP will be allowed to keep a percentage of the funds expended, not the funds they collect, but the funds they actually spend. So they have an incentive to spend that money in a timely manner to improve the 911 network reliability. I haven't come up with a percentage rate, so maybe we can talk a little bit about that today, or you can think about it and come back to me later. If at any time the Commission finds that this approach is not providing the desired improvements, the tariff rate may be declared null and void, and the contents of the 911 Reliability Fund will be reimbursed to the governing bodies proportional to their concurrent sessions. So basically, any money that the 911 authorities pay into the fund that isn't expended, if that fund is dissolved, the money will go back to those 911 authorities at the same proportion that they paid into it. So that is the first proposal, and I see some hands up already. Mandy, I think you were the first one in with your comment. How many CCS do we have in Colorado at this time? What is CCS, Mandy? And while she's typing that, I'll go on to, I saw Kimberly Culp raise her hand. Kimberly?
So I think Mandy's question is how many concurrent sessions, and that's, I wanted to start with that as well. As I'm just curious how much money we're talking about here. So how many concurrent sessions do we have in Colorado today?
608, according to my most recent count.
So 608, and it's 500 per concurrent session per month?
Correct. And that $500 was a placeholder until we decide what we want it to be. And it doesn't have to be the full $500. It says no greater than $500.
So I guess part of my concern that jumps out at me just in so many of the other conversations we've had, when infrastructure is being built out by a provider, our BESP or other providers, it's not dedicated to 911. They will have multiple traffic on that network, on that infrastructure that they build out. So they'll be able to have commercial traffic. It will improve their profit margin quite a bit. So just from carrying the cost alone, I guess that's my first concern of it's roughly $3.6 million. Have we thought about what portion of this infrastructure build out, improving some of this reliability should be paid for by a 911 surcharge when a company will be able, and the company would be Lumen, would be able to also put commercial traffic on that infrastructure?
I think that's a very good question, and it's one that I struggled with while I was working on this proposal, because it is one that's come up. It's a conundrum that has come up repeatedly in the workshops that we had. What CenturyLink, and I know CenturyLink is on the call, so I don't want to speak for CenturyLink, but I think one of the arguments that can be made is that if these were improvements that CenturyLink were going to make for commercial reasons, they would have already done it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to make money off of these connections once they're installed. So if you have suggestions on how we kind of split that hair, I think we're going to need to in order to make this work.
Okay, I have more questions, but I will hold so we have other folks that have raised their hand.
Okay. Let's see, who else do we have? Jackie?
Yeah, my question was just who determines and how do we determine that $500 a month, what exactly that's going to flesh out to be?
Yeah, and I think the way I was envisioning it is the commission would determine how much they want to direct of the state 911 surcharge to that when they set the state 911 surcharge by October. Obviously, it's going to be too late for this year, so this would be when they're setting the state 911 surcharge in October of 2022 to take effect in January of 2023. And maybe what CenturyLink puts in their tariff is not a specific amount. Maybe it's an amount to be determined by the commission. And so it would be part of that deliberative process that the commission takes when it's setting the state 911 surcharge rate every October. How much do we want to spend on 911 network reliability improvement in the following calendar year? And that would be based in part on the plan that's filed by CenturyLink, and how much it's going to take to fund that plan for improvement.
Okay, thanks.
Derek Walker.
Hey, so yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Derek Walker. I'm the director down in Durango, so I'm new to Colorado. So if I ask any or say any stupid questions, just kind of forgive me on the first go around here. I'm trying to wrap my mind around kind of Colorado, this relationship with CenturyLink and where we are and how we got where we are. So I'm a little confused around this concurrent sessions versus the trunks that you used to have and how you got into the paying based on concurrent sessions. And then the limitations on a T1. So, a T1 can technically provide 13 simultaneous conversations or calls, but yet it sounds like we're being limited less than the 13 based on whatever someone else came up with for concurrent sessions. And then earlier you'd mentioned that an outage doesn't actually get reported to the FCC as an outage if another PSAP is able to take that call, which is baffling to me. If a PSAP is down due to an EZNet failure, regardless if the call is rerouted to the EZNet, by default, I mean, that's still a reportable FCC issue. So I'm baffled by some of the things. I guess just because I'm new coming in.
Sure.
Definitely different than, I'll say it's definitely different than North Dakota and some other states that I've been part of.
Sure. So let me correct one thing. So I wasn't talking about reportable to the FCC. The FCC, it's still reportable to the FCC regardless. The PUC requires outage reporting for any outage of basic emergency service, which is basically anything from the selective router to the point that the call is handed off to the PSAP, so the demarcation point with the PSAP. Any outage of that portion of the 911 call flow that is 30 minutes or longer is reportable to the Public Utilities Commission. But I can tell you, because I was part of the rulemaking in 2017, we did not intend to word it so that if they just reroute it to another PSAP, it's no longer an outage, but that's the way it's worded. So I actually have a proposal later in my presentation to address that as part of this rulemaking. In terms of concurrent sessions, that was part of a year-long negotiation between CenturyLink and a number of the local 911 authorities when CenturyLink was negotiating its tariff for Emergency Services IP Network, or EZNet, for Colorado. They looked at, I know that the participants looked at a number of different pricing models, and the model that they came up with was based on the number of concurrent sessions at a 911 center. I think they did that instead of a T1 because a T1 doesn't scale as much. If you have up to 13 positions or 13 911 lines in your call center, you would pay the same as somebody with 2. So in order to make it scale better, they used concurrent sessions instead, so they could scale it all the way down to 2 concurrent sessions, which was how many most of the very small 911 centers in Colorado have and still have. So it scales a little better than the number of T1 lines. But you're right that the T1 line physically can hold up, can provide up to, I think it might actually be 12 concurrent sessions because there's a control channel, but I'm not positive on that. Somebody from CenturyLink can correct me. But 12 or 13 concurrent sessions can be carried on one T1. But that's the reason why the pricing unit is number of concurrent sessions. Kimberly, you have your hand up again?
Yeah, I'm just going to take my questions in doses so I don't dominate the conversation. So I guess my next question would be when we talk about tariff and putting all of this money into Lumen, nothing against them and their ability. So those on the call today, I'm not meaning anything offensive by this. But we did explore in those different meetings other providers being able to fortify, build out, create some reliability in the network that would be outside of the network, which could be arguably even a better process and plan because it's a different network, different switching, different equipment altogether. So are we open to that? I mean, this really seems like it's tariff, it's regulated, it's going to be one provider that is the certified BESP in Colorado, period. That's where this money is going to go. But I think the little bit of research we did indicated we may have other solutions and other providers that could offer some of that diversity as well, and maybe even cheaper.
So, and there's a couple of different ways that other providers can be involved, right? So the first way, because CenturyLink is already doing this in a number of parts of the state, using a third-party provider to supplement their own network. And I think, you know, when we talk about, let me get back to this page, in developing the plan, the BESP must take into consideration the most economical technology to achieve improvements in diversity. I think considering the possibility of partnering with third parties would be one of those things that we would direct them to do, because it can be more economical and provide better diversity depending on the situation. It wouldn't work in every situation probably, but would work in some of them. The other way would be to have another provider basically building another 911 network with another transport to the PSAP, maybe not statewide, maybe in portions of the state. And I think that's still a possibility. However, in order to do that under the commission's rules, a company would have to become certified as a BESP to deliver calls to a 911 center. If they're acting as a subcontractor to CenturyLink, then it's all under CenturyLink's BESP. And our rules don't rule that out. Another company can get certified as a BESP, but we just haven't found a company yet that's been interested in going through that process or filing a tariff. And Jennifer asks if this is the first, well, there are multiple proposals, but they're not competing proposals. They're meant to be taken as a group.
And Daryl, since they would have to file a plan with the commission, it would be cost-based, where they would have to, if they were leasing with another provider, they would have to show what that lease rate would be and disclose all of that to show that this is a cost-based offering, correct?
Correct. So my thought is that they can spend it on these things on a cost basis. They will be allowed to take a percentage off on top of that, so that they have a profit motive to actually engage in these activities. But it would have to be cost based. Jennifer?
So I'm thinking along the same lines as Kimberly, and thinking that it's absolutely important that Lumen continues to build resilience and reliability into their network, because they are the only BESP in Colorado. But I'm also wondering if it'd be possible to work with a second provider to become BESP certified, and then be a backup network. And I'm thinking specifically about the possibilities of FirstNet or Verizon, where if Century or if Lumen had a failure, we could switch that traffic to the other network to carry that load until CenturyLink can repair the whatever it is that's wrong. And my question is that something that the commission would consider creating, or a funding source out of the surcharge to not only work with Lumen, to continue building their resiliency, but also working with a second provider to provide a backup to the Lumen network should the Lumen network fail?
So I can't say what the commission will or won't do, but I will tell you that our rules do not prohibit a second company from coming in and becoming a BESP. We would need them to file an application to become certified as a BESP, and they would have to file a tariff. Now, whether that is done solely as a backup or whether it is done as a competing BESP with CenturyLink, I think would be up to that company to figure out how they want to approach it. But if they were encouraged to come in by the 911 community and file a certification application to just serve as a backup, I think that would be a very interesting application to review at the commission. I think my only real concern with that is that we would just need to see what the pricing is and see if it would make sense to essentially pay for two BESPs in Colorado, or whether that, would that result in a doubling of costs for the 911 authorities and paying for 911 service, or can they offer that backup at a lower rate than what CenturyLink is currently charging, so that it is economical enough to be used as a backup? But yeah, I mean, that is definitely a possibility. A company would have to come in and make that offer. Jeff?
Thank you.
Yeah, and Daryl, recall, we've seen folks that have entertained that in the past, and generally they're wanting to come in and cherry pick and only provide certain aspects of aggregation, not the whole enchilada per se.
Yeah, and where the sticking point seems to come down to is companies not willing to provide standardized statewide pricing, because that's something that is required in our rules. They want to offer pricing on an individual contract basis. And when they get pushback from the 911 authorities, that's usually when they withdraw their application. But that doesn't tell us necessarily that that's the way it's always going to be. If a company comes in and is serious about wanting to work in Colorado's regulatory environment to provide 911 service, they can file an application with us.
Daryl, I also wanted to point out on the 3.6 million, kind of put it in perspective. If Colorado's current population is 5.7 million, that works out to about 64 cents per person per year. And if you dilute that even further with our transient population, it seems like not a lot of money to insure 911 services.
Yeah, and I put the $500 in there, as I said, as a placeholder. But I'll give you an example. When the commission is setting its surcharge rate for the following calendar year, if we wanted to, because in the workshops we kind of tossed around the idea of 5 cents. What would 5 cents of a state 911 surcharge do in terms of funding for 911 network improvement? So 5 cents times 5.9 million lines in the state times 12 months. And that's where I came up with the $500, because that's about $3.5 million. $500 a month on each concurrent session would provide that 5 cents worth of funding from every person who has a telephone line in Colorado. But if 5 cents is too high, we can talk about a different amount. Maybe it's more like 1 cent or 3 cents. But the important point that I wanted to make from the 911 authority's point of view is that it would be budget neutral, because it would be put in the rules that the commission would consider that that cost as part of their annual 911 surcharge rate setting, so that the 911 authorities would be reimbursed for those costs that they're paying to CenturyLink for that tariff. Any other thoughts or comments? Regarding Kimberly's first comment, I think that's an important one. And maybe the way we address that is that we require that CenturyLink include in its plan any proposal that they have for allocation of costs. So if an improvement is going to cost $1 million, but they're also going to make money off of that improvement, maybe they have to propose to the commission how they would break down those costs. This much we'll pay for ourselves, and this much we propose to be paid for out of the 911 reliability fund. Kimberly?
So I think that those details definitely we need to probably continue to work out. And one of the other details would just be tying benchmarks and timelines. So I guess I feel different about just turning money over for infrastructure build out versus having control over the money and holding on to the money for benchmarks and deliverables and a timeline for things to be met, delivered on time, fully groomed, operational, meeting the mark, and then funds get released at these different intervals. So I know that's probably getting into some of the weeds, but I definitely think just turning monies over, even if we have reporting requirements, unless that language is really strong and with a lot of penalty and timely payback if they don't meet the benchmarks, then we may not get the results that we desire. So I know those details would just come later, but I wanted to throw that out as well.
Understood. Yeah, and one of the controls that's in there is the money has to be kept in a separate account, and if they don't spend the money in accordance with their plan, the remaining funds could be dissolved and put back to the 911 authorities. But there may be some room for some additional controls in there. Tracy had a comment. Let me see what this says. A frustration in the prior proceeding was incentive or lack thereof for a person to lead and vet the discussion on cost-effective alternatives, fiber swaps, leasing second route, and who thinks who is a good or bad partner. I think that's a very fair point, Tracy, and I think that's where a lot of the discussions in that working group got bogged down. And that's one of the reasons why I thought to structure it the way I did, so that CenturyLink is responsible for making a lot of those decisions, because it is their network, it is their business that they're engaging in. But at the same time, there's accountability back to the commission, and through the commission to the 911 authorities. So I think we have we run the risk if we put too much community oversight over the process, we run the risk of death by committee, which I think it was the path we were headed down with that 911 reliability working group.
We were there.
Yeah, maybe I'm being kind by saying we were headed down that path. So I wanted to avoid that with this. I don't want to create multiple committees to oversee everything that CenturyLink is doing in its own network. I think that is leading to too much complication, but at the same time, we don't want to say, here's a bunch of money, just spend it. without any oversight. So we have to find a balance between those two approaches. Any other comments on this first proposal? And I know I'm not asking for anybody to say they endorse this today or not, because this isn't even there's no language here for you to look at. This is just general concepts that I'm wanting to get some input on before I start trying to draft some language. Okay. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, proposal 2 is to make it so that not delivering 911 calls to the right PSAP is considered an outage. And really where this comes from is the commission's definition of basic emergency service, because we say any basic emergency service outage of over 30 minutes or more is an outage. But our definition of basic emergency service, the way it reads now, the first sentence says that basic emergency service means the aggregation and transport of a 911 call directly to a point of interconnection with a governing body or PSAP, regardless of the technology used to provide the service. My proposed change is very simple, to replace the word a with the appropriate. So now it would read, means the aggregation and transportation of a 911 call directly to a point of interconnection with the appropriate governing body or PSAP, regardless of the technology used to provide the service. We don't want to discourage CenturyLink from rerouting calls to other PSAPs if there's an outage, because that's a good mitigation strategy, but it doesn't mean that the outage didn't happen. And so we still need to treat it as an outage in terms of reporting and follow-up. And so that's what this would do. I want to see if anybody has any questions or comments about this. Jeff?
I guess my only concern would be, you know, if there's a problem with the connection to the PSAP and it diverts to, you know, we give them those alternatives every year, it would switch to. Is that still in the box, or is that an outage?
You're talking about condition 4 routing, where it's routing to a 7-digit number?
Correct. I couldn't think about it. You know, couldn't think of what it was.
Well, that would definitely still be an outage, and that's still an outage even under our current rules, because basic emergency service includes location information, which is not available if you're routing to a 7-digit number.
And that's why I'm wondering, is the term appropriate enough teeth, or does it need to be some other word?
I don't know. Kimberly?
Just from a condition 4 perspective, though, since that's an outage in the OSP network, from a condition 4 that actually falls outside of the rules and the tariff as it relates to that, and they just do it as a courtesy. Lumen does it as a courtesy, and it only impacts their particular customers. It's a sword I died on in the rulemaking.
Well, and it kind of depends on where it is, right? So if it's the same CO that serves the PSAP that gets isolated, it's a basic emergency service outage. If it's a CO that does not serve a PSAP, then it's considered an OSP outage. Mm-hmm. So it gets complicated. Mm-hmm. So do we need, if we were to Jeff's point, if we were to look at stronger language than this, what language would you consider? Or of course, maybe it's unfair to put people on the spot right now to suggest language, but if you have something you want to suggest, go ahead. If not, maybe this is something we can just think about in the meantime.
How about the designated demarc?
That kind of gets at what we're looking for.
Or pre-programmed demarc, something of that nature.
Something like that, I think would probably work. Like I said, we don't have to just think about it. If anybody thinks of a different way to word it that they think would be better, you can send that to me after the fact. But I want to make sure that everybody had their chance to ask their questions. Any other questions on proposal 2, or comments rather?
And I'm having trouble coming up with it, but I'm just thinking it needs to contain something about the dedicated or the demarc that's associated with the location of the device.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right, because I think you could read this the way I've got it written here, where it says the appropriate. Well, I say this is appropriate because we couldn't reach the main PSAP, so we sent it to another appropriate PSAP. So something a little stronger or a little more specific might be better.
Daryl, the rules definition of selective routing might be a good place to look for language. That definition says means the capability of routing a 911 call to a designated PSAP based upon the 7-digit or 10-digit telephone number of the subscriber dialing 911.
Okay. Come to think of it, that definition's a little old-fashioned with wireless technology, but
especially since we have some multi-PSAP demarcs these days.
right. Well, I will ponder this and see if I can come up with better wording than this, but you see where I'm trying to go with it, so that we don't have that loophole that was not intended to be in there. Okay, moving on. Proposal 3 is to prorate billing from outages. Add a requirement to our rules that the BESP prorate the bill sent to the 911 governing body for all basic emergency service outages in excess of 30 minutes in duration, so that the governing body is not paying for service that it did not receive. And I added a note here. The current EZNet tariff includes prorating for outages of certain types that exceed 4 hours in duration. So my proposal is to put it in our rules and to make it 30 minutes in duration instead of 4 hours, and have it be applicable to any basic emergency service outage. Bruce?
Daryl, if it's in an approved tariff at 4 hours, but this language in the rules that says 30 minutes, how do you, which one do you go with? Because the commission approved that tariff as well.
The rules supersede the tariff, is my understanding anyway.
Okay, thank you.
And I would talk about that with our commission counsel, who is on the call today, but I will not put her on the spot to answer legal questions. And I think Katie had a comment. Katie says, what about 4+ hour outages in the NRC period of the EZNet migration? Is there a mechanism for prorating these costs? Katie, I'm not entirely getting your question. If you can elaborate a little bit. Oh, I think I know what you're saying. So in the EZNet tariff, the non-recurring costs for implementation of the EZNet include 6 months of service without billing, and then billing starts after that 6 months. I don't think that will matter, Katie, because every PSAP in Colorado will have been migrated for more than 6 months before these rules take effect. I mean, even if I put these rules out, even if the commission issued these rules as a NOPR next week, which they're not going to, there's going to be a comment cycle and a reply cycle, and it has to go through the Secretary of State. So the last PSAP to migrate in Colorado that's actually paying the tariff rate is the well, we've got Western Rio Blanco just migrated. The only ones we have left are the military bases, not all the military bases, but some of the military bases, and 2 of CSP's centers. So assuming those happen within the next month or 2, I don't think there'll be an issue here. It is a good question though, Katie. If for some reason any of those 6-month periods do overlap the implementation of these new rules, it's something we'll have to take into consideration. Jeff?
And Daryl, I guess I don't understand what we're trying to do here. Are we trying to modify behavior? Are we trying to penalize them for this occurring? Sometimes these things are beyond their control. What is it, and how often would this occur? And I know it just sounds like brain damage trying to to figure this out and get the billing straightened out with regard to it.
I think there's a couple of things here. One is it is a matter of fairness. If you did not receive a service, should you be required to pay for it? The other thing is having another incentive for CenturyLink to ensure that their network is reliable and is able to deliver 911 calls on a consistent basis. So it's actually both of those things and I don't know that I would propose this in and of it by itself without the first proposal that I gave today, which gives CenturyLink funding to actually improve their network reliability. I think the flip side of that is if we're giving you funding to improve your network reliability, there needs to be accountability if that does not happen. So this is the accountability side of that.
And I guess what I look back at is, I can remember the days when we used to pay T&M for service, and then we went to, maintenance support contracts, and which were expensive, but under those, their technicians would have to put in whatever time it would take to get a thing corrected. And so I think over the years, we've had plenty of above and beyond service from, Quest and then CenturyLink and Lumen, and at times of need. So I don't mean to be their advocate here. I just, I feel like I've always gotten pretty good support from them.
Yeah, and I would say, Jeff, on a statewide basis, I've heard stories like yours, and I've heard stories from people who are very unhappy with the service they've gotten. So I think it somewhat depends on the part of the state you're in and the state of the network there.
And coming from a rural area and now in a metropolitan area, I absolutely agree that the two are very, very different experiences.
Your audio is very low, Bruce.
I was just going to say that coming from a rural area and now working in the metro area, I would agree that it's two very, very different experiences.
Any other thoughts or comments on this proposal? Okay. So those 3 proposals were about 911 reliability. The next 3 are not necessarily directly related to 911 reliability, but if we are addressing the rules, this might be a good opportunity to make some additional changes that would be beneficial to the 911 community and 911 service in Colorado. So the first additional proposal, this is proposal number 4, create a new section of the rules outlining what must be included in a basic emergency service offering. Part of the reason for this is kind of goes back to what I was talking about with Jennifer earlier in the call today, which is that our rules do not preclude another company from coming in and offering basic emergency service. They have to get certified with the commission as a basic emergency service provider, and they have to file a tariff. But and we have a section of the rules talking about how to file to become a basic emergency service provider. But we don't have anything about what has to be in the tariff, or rather we do, but it's spread out in multiple sections of the commission's rules. So what I would like to do is create a section in the commission's rules that talk about what needs to be in a basic emergency service offering or tariff. So the first part of this would be to incorporate in one place rules that already exist. That would be, for instance, our rule that requires that basic emergency service tariffs be averaged statewide. And they also must be cost-based with a proposed profit margin. Those are rules that exist in different parts of the commission's overall 911 section of the rules that I would like to bring into one area so that somebody who wants to see what it takes to file a basic emergency service tariff in Colorado can see what all of those requirements are in one place. The second reason for this would be to require pricing to be based on concurrent session, because that's how the state 911 surcharge distributions are structured in statute. And we can't change that without changing the statute. So as long as the statute says that the state 911 surcharge funds will be distributed based on number of concurrent sessions, we need to make sure that the pricing is also based on number of concurrent sessions, like it is in our current tariff. So any company that comes in the future that wants to offer basic emergency service in Colorado needs to not only base that or average those costs statewide, but they need to base the pricing on number of concurrent sessions so that those costs can be reimbursed through the state 911 surcharge. And I want to include a list of features that need to be included at a minimum with a state of 911 or a 911 tariff. I don't have an exhaustive list to give you today, but we could talk about if you have ideas as what would be included in that list of minimum number or minimum features that should be included in a basic emergency service offering. I would be glad for you to send those to me after. One that I think was overlooked when we were doing our current EZNet tariff was the ability to transfer calls to other providers in neighboring states. That's something that we had before we went to the EZNet, and now we do not. So we need to get that back. So one of the things that I would do would be to include that as a required feature with a grace period to allow Lumen time to implement that. Jackie?
I thought in our tariff we said that we would not lose capability that we already had. And I think that's why we were thinking, because I know we had that conversation about transferring, and maybe Kimberly can remember. I remember having the conversation about being able to transfer to neighboring states, and that we also had the clause that we wouldn't lose something we already had.
Yeah, as it relates to diversity, specifically, it was whatever existed at that time had to remain.
Right, as network diversity.
Yep.
Was there, and I don't recall any language though saying that all other features would be mirrored.
I don't either. I just remember specifically that carving out the space as it related to network diversity. But I would want to review the language just to be sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that made it into the settlement agreement.
It did. It did.
Transferring to other states?
Oh, no, just the diversity, what existed in the network at a particular snapshot in time. But
yeah,
I don't recall transferring to other states as being in there.
Okay. Yeah, I just
that's just an example. That's just an example, but there may be other things. You know, like, and you know, we might want to think about this because this could provide, and you might be thinking about things that CenturyLink isn't doing, but I think it's just as important to include features that CenturyLink is doing, but we want anyone else who's coming into this space to do the same. So the ability to reroute calls to other PSAPs in the event of an outage, for instance, I think would probably be a good minimum feature for any basic emergency service offering in the state. So be thinking about that. And I'd be interested in getting any suggestions from you as to what could or should be included in that. Proposal 5, specify that text to 911 delivered via interim methods, not delivered via the basic emergency service network, are exempt from commission rules. So currently, we exempt the delivery of text to 911 via interim methods in our current definition of basic emergency service, but we don't define what interim methods are. And now that we're talking about the possibility of delivering text to 911 via the EZInet, I think it's important that our rules are clear as to which kinds of text to 911 are regulated and which kinds of text to 911 are not. And at the time that we addressed this in our rules in 2017, we really didn't want to try to regulate text to 911 coming from the TCCs or through an intermediary provider from the TCCs to the PSAP, because if we tried to address those as if they were 911 calls, we would have had to certify all of those different companies as basic emergency service providers. When really that was always just a temporary measure. Delivering text to 911 calls outside of the basic emergency service network to a PSAP is an interim method, which is the same term that the FCC uses, but we haven't defined it. So what I would like to do is define what an interim text to 911 method is so that it's clear which types are regulated and which are not. Any thoughts on this?
I think we definitely, sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Okay. Nobody else is talking, so go ahead.
Sometimes we do really good with protocol, another time I just can't help it.
Yeah.
Tisk.
So I think we need I think we need some work here, because I was talking with Lumen again and bringing text into the EZInet. I really think it's going to be doable. It's not going to really create any issues. So I think just hashing out this language here is going to be important to make sure we capture interim methods that are being used today with MSRP, and then things we don't know as it relates to text. So my thought is we just probably need a little bit more language around this, but I can send you stuff.
Okay, that would be helpful. Any other thoughts on this item? Okay. I'm sorry?
Daryl, has Lumen or someone else voiced a concern that the existing language is not good enough for the purpose?
Well, I had a conversation with Tim Goodwin, who's no longer with CenturyLink, but we were talking about the definition of basic emergency service. And I mentioned that, and I can't remember exactly how it came up. I think we were talking about the inclusion of text to 911 into the EZInet service, and that interim methods for delivery of text to 911 are exempted in our definition of basic emergency service. And he made the comment that he didn't know what interim methods was. And I couldn't point him to a definition because we don't have a definition in there of what interim methods is. That seems like an oversight to me. If we're going to exempt a 911 call delivery type from the definition of basic emergency service, we need to be clear as to what we're exempting.
I like it. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, now I saved my big out of the box. You guys are think I'm crazy. Gonna think I'm crazy proposal for the last. I'm going to preface this one before I even go to the slide. So for years now, we have struggled with the fact that the only statewide funding mechanism we have for 911 is the tariff. The tariff is approved by the commission. The fact that we have only had one basic emergency service provider means that everybody's paying the same rates. The rates are based on, they're scaled somewhat based on the PSAP, but everyone's paying the same rates, but it can only pay for certain things. It can pay for the basic emergency service network. So we have never had a funding source to pay for other things that other states pay for out of their state 911 surcharges, like training of telecommunicators, public education, statewide GIS data collection programs. Another thing that we have not had funding for in Colorado is the Colorado 911 Resource Center, which is running out of money in 2023. So proposal number 6 is, well, there's my examples there that I gave. So statewide public education campaign, statewide GIS data collection, funding related to minimum training standards, funding of the Colorado 911 Resource Center. So one thing that has been talked about recently, and Kimberly is actually holding a meeting tomorrow on the topic of the CCOA, the Colorado Coalition of Authorities, to help create a state level or statewide funding mechanism to pay for some of these things as the group sees as appropriate. My proposal is that we require the BESP to amend their tariff to include an unspecified rate per concurrent session to be set by the commission to fund activities of the EZNet users group or a successor organization representing all 911 governing bodies. The successor organization could be the CCOA once it's up and running. But in the meantime, we would be creating a fund that could be used by the 911 authorities to fund certain things. The commission would set the actual rate when they're establishing the state 911 surcharge rate for the following year. A proposed budget from the EZNet users group or successor organization would be taken into consideration when setting the tariff rate. And the cost of this rate would be included in calculations for the surcharge rate so that governing bodies would be reimbursed for this additional tariff charge. The BESP would be allowed to keep a small percentage to cover the administrative costs of collecting and transferring these funds from the governing bodies. Don't know what that percentage is, but that's part of the proposal. The funds would be transferred to an account to be established by the users group. The users group would file reports with the commission quarterly on the status of those funds. If the tariff is not producing the desirable results, the commission may declare it null and void, and any remaining funds unspent by the users group would be deposited in the 911 surcharge trust cash fund and distributed. So basically it would be distributed back to the 911 authorities based on concurrent session. So that's my out of the box proposal. Kimberly?
So what is the purpose of having it part of the tariff in the BESP versus just having it go from the state 911 surcharge for an amount that we possibly can get approved, go to the authorities, and then the authorities pay in if they join like a CCOA? So
the problem with that is that we can't change how much we're distributing to each 911 authority. So we either reimburse everybody or we reimburse nobody.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's voluntary to join the CCOA, you might end up with some 911 authorities being members and paying their dues and getting reimbursed through the state 911 surcharge, and have other 911 authorities who choose not to join the CCOA who can then just take that money that they're getting for the reimbursement and use it for something else. By having it in the tariff, and have it part of the tariff rate that everybody pays, then it ensures 100% participation.
I guess I just don't know how I feel about getting our BESP in the middle of that, even if it is just collecting and distributing and then they're retaining additional fees, versus having the EZNet group voluntary association where members pay. But I mean, we can hash some of those pros and cons out tomorrow too in the meeting.
Yep, I think, if there's another path forward that people would prefer, I'm not married to this, but I've been working on the problem of what happens if not everybody joins? How do we reimburse the 911 authorities if not everybody participates in the CCOA? And this is a way of making sure that everybody does participate and does it in a way that's budget neutral to the 911 authorities, so that is not, hopefully not as onerous as saying you have to join and you have to pay and you're paying it out of your own money. Jeff?
Yeah, that would have been my concern. And again, as Kimberly says, we can discuss it tomorrow, but I fear that it would be the usual suspects that attend these meetings who would voluntarily join and others would not, the majority would not.
Right. And where that only becomes an issue, I think, is, because if they don't join, they don't get the benefits of joining the CCOA. But where that becomes an issue is how do we reimburse them, the ones who do join, but not reimburse the ones that don't. Vicki?
Well, I want to echo. I think that I've always been concerned about that. How we're going to have some people putting into it and then discerning who then is worthy of those funds after the fact. I feel like it could be more fair this way, because it would be equitable on all the way across. I understand where Kimberly's coming from about the concern about having a BESP collecting that, but I think when it's voluntarily like that, we're going to have, as Jeff said, the usual suspects. So,
Bruce says.
Carol, this is Patty.
Patty, go ahead.
Yeah, and probably for tomorrow as well. If we did go that route through the tariff, does that put any restraint on us from becoming political, which one of the things that we had talked about is needing lobbyists?
And I don't know the answer to that question. I think that would have to be explored.
Yeah, and this is Kimberly again. I just think that we definitely need to explore this. It's not a bad idea, and I understand 100%, and we really want to strive for 100%, of course. But we really also, I think, even more important than the 100% is the ability for the 911 authorities to have a voice and not be and be able to afford a lobbyist and not have to worry about putting anybody in a difficult situation or having it tied to the commission, the tariff, or any of those pieces, because then it just, there's times that people can't say and do certain things just by nature of their employment. So I think we would maybe even want a legal opinion on that before we get too far down that path on language.
Okay. Bruce made a comment, said, I'm trying to figure out the statutory piece of there. Would there need to be any changes? I don't believe so, Bruce. And the reason I don't believe so is because the commission has very broad authority to regulate basic emergency service. If we say that funding of the EZNet users group for this purpose would be part of that service, then I think the commission has the ability to require that in a tariff. And what the state 911 surcharge is for, according to the tariff, or excuse me, according to statute, is to reimburse the tariff rates that are being charged by CenturyLink or by whoever the BESP is. Any other thoughts or questions? So we've gotten feedback. I've asked for feedback after each proposal. Are there other things that you would like us to consider when we are thinking about drafting language for this? And it sounds to me like we probably need to have at least one more follow-up workshop to talk about these proposals in a little more detail after you've all had time to think about them. But in the meantime, are there other things that you would like to put on the list? And if you have something, but you're having trouble putting it into words, you can always talk to me about it later. Jeff, go ahead.
One thought that came to mind when we were talking about the resource center and the oversight of the monies that would be used for outage or for network diversity. Could the whoever the person is, or the resource center, or what its new entity will be the overseer of the spending of those monies.
For the 911 reliability fund?
Right. If we establish that, and we talked about how we would make sure that those monies were being spent and things were getting taken care of, could that be the overseer and somehow part of the funding of that organization, whether we call it the resource center or whatever, derived from that?
I would have to think about that. It's an interesting suggestion. I think you might have difficulty. It might amount to the commission delegating authority to a nonprofit, which I don't think we would be allowed to do, but there might be some other role for the resource center in there.
And I don't know that they'd actually direct, the operations or the repairs or whatever, but they would be in kind of a monitoring position to provide monitoring of the spending of those monies and report back to us and what have you.
I will think on that further.
And that way too, whoever the employee is or employees of the organization would have someone who's a technical person that would have the wherewithal to do that.
Okay. Any other suggestions? Well, I want to thank you all for joining and participating. I scheduled 2 hours for this, and it doesn't look like we're going to get to an hour and a half, but I wanted to thank you all for participating. This is being recorded, like I said, so I'll make this available to anyone who was unable to attend in person. Last slide, just my contact information. I think you all have my email address, but just in case you don't, because there's a few names on here that I don't recognize. If you have any thoughts or suggestions on any of this, please feel free to email me or give me a call, and we can talk through some of it. I do think that some of the proposals I gave today need some further discussion and consideration of the details, which is very fair. But I want to thank everyone for not just getting out your virtual pea shooters and letting me know what you think of the proposals. And in the meantime, if you have other proposals, if you have any alternative suggestions, I'm not the only person here. So if anybody has any other suggestions on how we might be able to do this better, feel free to email me your thoughts or give me a call and we can talk through it. And I will take those. We'll take those and see if there's a way that we can work those in. So thanks everybody for participating, and I hope you have a really good rest of your afternoon.
Daryl, thank you for your effort on this.
Yes, thanks for your work on this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.